So today we are going to start the chapter 2, which is entitled Hypothalamic and Hypophyseal Hormones. As the title suggests, in this chapter 2, we will be talking about the different hormones that are going to be produced from the hypothalamus, as well as the different hormones that are produced from the hypophysis, the anterior or posterior hypophysis. Okay, so first of all, we will define what the hypothalamus is and what the pituitary is. Okay, during all this chapter and during all this course, hypophysis, I can call it hypophysis or pituitary gland. Okay, both of these nomenclatures are right. So we will first talk about the hypothalamus part, the definition of the two, and then start with the different hormones produced with the hypothalamus before going and having more details about the hypophysis. So let's start with the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, it's a part of the brain. So it is a part of the central nervous system. It's a part of the brain, and it is composed of neurons, okay, and different nuclei. In this slide, I just wanted to show you the location of the hypothalamus in the brain, which is in purple here. And this here, where you can see it, it is underneath the thalamus that is here. So you can see the hypothalamus. This is this area. And you can see also its relationship with the pituitary. And here I would like to say that the pituitary has a completely different type of tissue. And some parts of the pituitary, they are not composed of neurons. So this is why I want to emphasize on the difference in between the two. The hypothalamus is a complete part of the brain. A lot of studies are going, for example, to study these neurons in the brain, in the hypothalamus, but we are interested in this part, in particular in our course of endocrinology, because as you remember in the first chapter, when I talked about the neuroendocrinology or the neuroendocrine integration, if you remember. So what is the relationship between the neurons and the endocrine glands? And in particular, this is true for this part of the brain, which is in fact at the interface between the central nervous system and the endocrine. So this is the part that is going to, if you want to make the connection between an impulse or between a neurotransmitter, a message coming from the central nervous system, and that should change something in our body through changes that are going to be taking place in the pituitary and to arrive to other hormones. Okay, so in this slide, you just need to know where is the hypothalamus and not anything else, like all the different other parts or lobes of the brain. They are not required. So the hypothalamus is a very small structure of 4 grams. It is at the basal part of diencephalon, lying between below the thalamus. The primary interface between the central nervous system and the endocrine system, at the same time, it's an integral part of the central nervous system and an endocrine gland. So at the same time, this is why it is at the interface between the central nervous system. It's completely composed of different nuclei of neurons, يعني clusters of neurons. Okay, so it's composed of different clusters of neurons, each of these clusters of neurons having a different role. This is the role of the hypothalamus. It's to connect the central nervous system to the endocrine system. So it's at the same time an integral part of the central nervous system and an endocrine gland, because as you will see, this hypothalamus is going to control and to regulate the function of the endocrine gland, which is the pituitary or adeno or neurohypophysis. Via the pituitary gland, the hypothalamus controls the function of peripheral endocrine glands, such as adrenal and thyroid glands. So here we are giving just 2 examples of many other examples where the hypothalamus is going to control their function. In particular, the adrenal and thyroid glands are going to be under the influence of the hypothalamus through the pituitary gland, we will see the HPA axis, for example. Okay, when we say the HPA axis is hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal cortex, adrenal gland. So this axis is not the only axis that is going to relate the hypothalamus to the pituitary, but other axes do also exist in order to regulate other peripheral hormones. It contains a big number of nuclei. What the definition of nuclei in the hypothalamus is a cluster of neurons. So the neurons in the hypothalamus are present, and they are present under the form of different clusters. They cluster together, and each cluster has a different name. So, for example, I have paraventricular nuclei or supraoptic nuclei. So these are two clusters of neurons. Each having a different function, a different location in the hypothalamus, and sometimes you have the functions of these different clusters of neurons or nuclei that are going to overlap. Okay, so their role are not just exclusive, and you will understand better what I mean by this during the explanation of the chapter. Okay, so what you need to also know that the hypothalamus is composed of different types of neurons, that these neurons are going to be clustered together in different clusters. Each one of these clusters is going to be called nuclei. An example of such neuron clusters is the supraoptic nuclei, SUN, and the paraventricular nuclei, or PVN, with different location in the hypothalamus. Now that we know the definition and the location of the hypothalamus, let's see what is the pituitary gland. You can also call it hypophysis. It is located at the base of the hypothalamus, so it's underneath the hypothalamus. It's composed of two lobes that are completely different, and these lobes are called the anterior and posterior lobes. So I do have the anterior pituitary and posterior pituitary, and you can kind of consider them as two organs. They are completely different. Both of them, they are going to compose the pituitary gland or hypophysis, but at the level of the tissue that is going to compose these two lobes, you will see that they are completely different. So the first one that I'm going to be calling the anterior pituitary, and the second part that I'm going to be calling the posterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary, or also called adenohypophysis, okay, it contains hormone-producing adenoid cells. So the histology of this gland here is like any other endocrine gland in my body. It is composed of endocrine cells, okay, endocrine glandular cells. While the posterior pituitary, also called the neurohypophysis, it contains the axon terminals of neurosecretory cells originating in the hypothalamus. Okay, so here the pituitary is going to be divided into two parts, two lobes. The first lobe is going to be called the anterior pituitary, or also you can call it adenohypophysis, because this part of the hypophysis, it has a glandular nature. So this is why we call it adenohypophysis, glandular nature, adenoid or glandular cells. So these are endocrine cells here. While in the neurohypophysis or posterior hypophysis, which is called neurohypophysis, it is composed of axon terminals of neurosecretory neurons, cells originating in the hypothalamus. So neurosecretory cells, so this means that these are neurons for which their body of the neuron is going to be present in the nuclei in the hypothalamus, and then the terminals of their axons are going to be present in the posterior pituitary, where they are going to produce different types of hormones, in particular oxytocin and ADH for antidiuretic hormone. So you can imagine that oxytocin ADH are going to be produced in the hypothalamus, synthesized in the body, but then they have to be processed during their passage in the terminal axons, and they are going to be released into the blood at the level of the posterior pituitary, which is composed of these axon terminals. In particular, they are coming from two types of clusters or nuclei in the hypothalamus: the paraventricular nucleus for the oxytocin, and the supraoptic nucleus for the antidiuretic hormone. Now, I just want to emphasize on the fact that this is not exclusive. So what I mean by this is that the paraventricular nuclei is not exclusively going to produce oxytocin. It has the ability to produce other types of molecules or hormones as well. Supraoptic nucleus, same thing. You can see it, this nuclei of neurons that is present in the hypothalamus, producing some interesting molecules or hormones, and then they are going to be processed, such as ADH, but then it's not exclusive. Other hormones can also be produced. So this is the definition of my hypothesis. One of the most important functions of the hypothalamus is to link the central nervous system to the endocrine system through the pituitary gland. Okay? So, what is the function of this hypothalamus? Hypothalamus is يعني إذا بدكم تعتبروه the last part of the central nervous system that is going to receive the message from higher levels of the central nervous system, and that is going to communicate it either to the blood or to to the blood or into a portal vein that I will be explaining to you. And this is how this message is going to be transformed from a neurotransmitter message, from the central nervous system, into another type of chemical message, which is an endocrine hormonal message. Okay, هيمرق من neurotransmitter لهرمونال message. لأنه بالcentral nervous system, higher level تبع central nervous system, all the messages are going to be conducted through neurotransmitter through synapses. So here is a nice presentation of the relationship between the hypothalamus that you can see it here represented by different geometrical forms that are intended to present, in fact, the different nuclei, clusters of neurons that are present in the nucleus, and then how it is going to be related to the adenohypophysis and to the neurohypophysis, يعني anterior with posterior. Always pay attention which one is the anterior, which one is the posterior, depending on each figure. In this figure in particular, my anterior pituitary is here, and as you can see, it's composed of endocrine cells, and my posterior pituitary is here, and it's not going to be composed of endocrine cells. It's composed of the axon terminals of neurons that are present. In particular, if you continue these axon terminals to here, you can see that the body of these neurons are present in the supraoptic nucleus, or they are going to be present in the paraventricular nucleus. So as you can see, the hypothalamus is composed of many nuclei clusters. In particular, two of them are going to prolong their axons into the neurohypophysis or posterior hypophysis. That's fine. This is how I can define the relationship between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary. Now, what about the relationship between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary? Here, the story is completely different, and it's really surprising and interesting to see how the link is going to be present in between the hypothalamus and these endocrine glands in the adenohypophysis. So here I do have a specific a system, a blood system, which is going to be called the portal vessels, okay? The hypophyseal portal vessels, portal vessels. And here, what I have is that I have hormones, or neurohormones, I'm going to call them, because they are going to be produced from neurons, okay? And they are going to be dispersed into the blood, that are going to be produced from different clusters in the hypothalamus, and then they are going to be released at the level of a capillary plexus. يعني هون في عندي مثل capillary plexus, okay, capillary loops that are going to be highly vascularized على هيدا الليفل يلي هو اسمه الميديان eminence. and they are going to take these neurohormones into this small vascularization system, okay? And in this portal vessel, these hormones are going to be concentrated here, and then they are going to be arriving into another capillary plexus that is going to distribute through capillaries these hormones to the endocrine cells that are present in the adenohypophysis. يعني عندي مثل كأنه صلة وصل قصيرة، مثل كأنه blood system عم يعمل كورس سيركوي، دونك طريق مختصرة وعم تجمع بين الهايبوثالاموس وبين الانتيريور pituitary بين الادينوهايبوفيسيس in order to bring those neurohormones in a concentrated manner to the endocrine cells that are present in the adenohypophysis. The whole story also, you can see it here in this schematic representation. You have here the anterior pituitary and there the posterior pituitary. Always when you see the axon of the terminals of the axons, this is the posterior pituitary. This should be the paraventricular nucleus, should be the supraoptic nucleus. The other nuclei present in the hypothalamus are going also to produce other types of neurohormones that are going to be released at the level of the portal system, hypophyseal portal system, in order to be taken through the portal vessels to the other capillary plexus, where they are going to stimulate and regulate the function of the anterior pituitary. Now I would like to discuss with you some of the experimentations, experiences that have been done early when we were discovering the role of each of these organs. The neurovascular hypothesis. So you remember that at the beginning of the endocrine studies, they usually used to use methods of the removal of the endocrine gland, and then they look at the consequences of this removal. I remove the gland and the organ, and I look at this animal, for example, to see what are the consequences at the level of the phenotype level or behavioral level. And you can remember that Claude Bernard, when he first did the first experiments on cockerels, when he castrated them by removing the testes, and he saw that there's a change in their phenotype, but also there's a change in their behavior. The second type of experimentation is when you transplant this removed organ into an ectopic site, which what we mean by ectopic site is when you bring it back to the animal, but you put it in another site. And if you remember, we said that when you transplant these testes into the animal, they will be back to the normal phenotype and behavior. So there is no nerve innervation at the place where these glands, for example, were present. So let's see what are the results of such experiments regarding the pituitary gland. Removal of the pituitary glands leads to atrophy of the adrenal cortex, thyroid, and gonads. If I remove the pituitary gland, okay, اللي هي موجودة underneath the hypothalamus, this will lead to atrophy. So it's like you lose the organs, they lose their form.
يعني هي essential للwork تبعهم.
Yes, exactly. So the removal of the pituitary gland leads to the atrophy of the adrenal cortex, thyroid, and gonads. يعني أنا إذا بشيلها لهالبيتويتري بتطلع بالادرينال كورتكس بصير إنه صار في عنده atrophy، تقلص. بصير بلاقي إنه كمان في عندي thyroid تقلص، والجونادز كمان في عندي تقلص بالتستس والأوفريز. So I can say first that the pituitary gland is going to regulate the normality of these other glands. So there is a relationship between this pituitary and these glands. So it looks like it's important for their phenotype and for their functionality. Let's see what happens if I transplant this pituitary to an ectopic site in an animal. So it's a site that is not the normal site where it's present, to any other site, okay, such as under the kidney capsule. This will lead to a similar end organ atrophy. So it didn't bring back the normal phenotype of the adrenal cortex, thyroid, or gonads. I still have an atrophy of these organs. So this means that its place is very
No, the
important.
place is important.
Sorry?
Yes, I am saying the same words that you said. No, the place is important for its function.
Exactly, exactly. So it's important for its function. So this means, so either I do have some, for example, nervous innervation or something else that is going to uh, show me the importance of this pituitary gland in its place. Now, if I transplant the pituitary back under the hypothalamus, if I transplant it back to under the hypothalamus, this is going to be followed by revascularization and functional reactivation of the pituitary. So it's very important for this pituitary to be at its place underneath the hypothalamus, okay, below the hypothalamus. Furthermore, other experiments have shown that the transaction of the pituitary stalk, I will show it to you, the pituitary stalk here, if I cut at this level, okay, the transaction of the pituitary stalk, or I put a barrier here, okay, اللي هو السtalk that is going to connect, in fact, the hypothalamus to the pituitary. The transaction of the pituitary stalk or placement of a barrier between the hypothalamus and the pituitary leads to the atrophy of the pituitary and its target organs. And this, of course, shows that the place of the pituitary underneath the hypothalamus is very important, because it looks like the pituitary itself is going to be regulated by the hypothalamus, and then it's going to regulate other glands such as the cortex, the thyroid, and the gonads. So the scientist Geoffrey Harris concluded it's difficult to escape from the conclusion that the hypophyseal portal supply has some specific effect in activating anterior pituitary tissue. لأنه حتى لو أنا حطيت بارير على هيدا الhypophyseal portal system، هيدا الhypophyseal portal system هيدا، okay, if I put a barrier here, it's for him, it's difficult to escape from the conclusion that the hypophyseal portal system or supply has some specific effect in activating anterior pituitary tissue. Furthermore, transplantation of the pituitary. Here is another experimentation that is completely different, and then the conclusion is also very important from this experiment. If you take young rats, young rats that are still immature، هدول اليونج rats immature يعني بعد ما في عندي البوبرتي، okay. Transplantation of the pituitary from the young rats under the pituitary stalk of an adult female، بدلت يعني أخذت من اليونج rats pituitary حطيتهم بadult female، could reactivate the pituitary gonadal axis، بيرجع الأكسس pituitary gonads بيشتغل when translated into adult female rats, even if the donor youngs were still immature. So this shows you what? What does this show me? This shows me something very important. It shows me that the pituitary activity is not intrinsic to this gland by itself. Rather, it's going to be controlled by the hypothalamus. Okay, لو كانت هي البيتويتري بحد ذاتها هي اللي عم تعطيني هالمسج، كانت هون ما بقدر اعمل ري اكتيفيشن للبيتويتري جونادال اكسس عند الادلت فيميلز، وايل انه انا اخذ البيتويتري من يونج راتس. يعني المفروض تكون هالبيتويتري لليونج راتس منا ادابتد على الادلت فيميل، وما يكون في عندي هالبيتويتري جونادال اكسس، ما في عندي اكتيفيشن للجونادز، اوكي. من الاوجينيسيس فور اكزامبل. but it did. So this shows انه من مين ما اخذتها هالبيتويتري يونج راتس ولا لا، the consequences do not depend on the pituitary itself. There's something that is going to control the pituitary. So according to Harris كمان, the anterior pituitary secretory activity is not due to any intrinsic property. لو كانت it's an intrinsic property لهالانتيريور pituitary كان هون ما بيصير في عندي reactivation للpituitary gonadal axis عند الادلت females rats. It is not due to any intrinsic property of the tissue itself, but to some outside stimulus derived from the central nervous system. So في عندي stimulus from the central nervous system that arrives to the pituitary and that is going to manage its secretory activity. These observations led Harris to elaborate what is called the neurovascular hypothesis. So the neurovascular hypothesis, humoral factors released by the hypothalamus were carried by the portal blood vessels to the pituitary to regulate hormone secretion. So this is very important. إنه أنا عم بحكي عن الهايبوثيسيس تبع neurovascular hypothesis. في عندي some factors that are going to be taken by the blood and that are going to be released by the hypothalamus, and these factors are going to be carried by the portal blood vessels to the pituitary to regulate its hormone secretion. And depending on these factors released from the hypothalamus, the pituitary will react by producing a different kind of a hormone, for example. Okay, by producing or producing less, يعني activating or inhibiting its activity of as an endocrine gland. So hypothalamic releasing and inhibiting hormones. So now we know that in the hypothalamus I have some factors that are going to be produced that I'm going to call them factors, or I can also call them releasing and inhibiting hormones. So في عندي releasing أو inhibiting hormones that are going to be produced from the hypothalamus and that are going to be directly carried to the anterior pituitary via the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal vein, hypothalamic hypophyseal portal vein, okay, which is the pituitary portal system. Okay, so these are the long portal vein in the between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. Now, I know that this figure here is kind of complicated and not very clear, but what is written here is still very important because it's gonna explain to you how this blood supply is going to collect the hormones or factors from the hypothalamus and then to bring them to the anterior pituitary, and how these factors are going to specifically stimulate some cells of the anterior pituitary and not others. So the blood of the pituitary gland is supplied by the superior and inferior hypophyseal arteries. The blood اللي بيعمل supply للpituitary gland is going to be supplied by two arteries, superior and inferior hypophyseal arteries. The inferior hypophyseal artery provides the blood to the posterior pituitary. So بنرجع بنأكد إنه كل مرة بدنا نرجع نشوف وين الposterior وين الانterior. In this figure here, I have this is my anterior pituitary adenohypophysis, and the one that is posterior pituitary is here, and this one is composed of endocrine cells, while this one is going to be composed of the axon terminals of the axon of the supraoptic and what is the supraoptic, and the supraoptic should be somewhere here, and the paraventricular nuclei. هيدا paraventricular, for example. Okay, and this is the supraoptic, and they are going to diverse their hormones here. لكن اللي بدي أنا من هون إنه هال supply of blood to the pituitary is going to be brought by two arteries, superior artery and inferior artery. If we start with the inferior hypophyseal artery, it provides blood to the posterior pituitary. So it's going to provide the blood. Here is the inferior hypophyseal artery that is going to bring the blood to the posterior pituitary. While the superior hypophyseal artery, the superior one, is going to supply the neural stack as well as the anterior pituitary. So it's going to bring the blood to the to this neural stack to form, in fact, what I call the primary capillary plexus. The superior hypophyseal artery gives rise to the hypophyseal portal circulatory system. This the superior hypophyseal artery is what gives rise to the hypophyseal portal circulatory system اللي هي الhypophyseal portal system. The first capillary plexus in the portal system is investing the median eminence. So بيألف superior hypophyseal artery a primary capillary plexus at the level of the median eminence where it's going to take hormones يلي هن delivered by here هون. They are going to be delivered by, for example, the other nuclei from the hypothalamus. Okay, so this is the hypothalamus hypophyseal tract, primary plexus, as you can see here. Primary plexus. And then the first capillary plexus in the portal system is investing the median eminence and neural stalk, where a subset of hypothalamic neurons releases hormones that will target appropriate adenohypophyseal cells in the anterior pituitary. Thus, the inhibiting and releasing hormones that control adenohypophyseal secretions are delivered via long portal vein. Okay, الهرمونز اللي هن سميناهم ان احنا قلنا يا اما releasing او inhibiting hormones produced by the hypothalamus, different types of clusters, and that are going to be reversed at the level of the primary capillary plexus. Okay, they are going to be taken through the portal system. Inhibiting and releasing hormones that control adenohypophyseal secretions are delivered via long portal veins to the anterior pituitary, where they bind to appropriate receptors to regulate the adenohypophyseal cells. They bind to specific receptors here on specific cells, of course, and this will stimulate by activating or inhibiting the activity of some of these cells. So the answer هتكون increase or decrease of a release of a certain hormone. Okay, of course بعدين في عندي venal system that is going to collect all the hormones of the anterior pituitary and that are going to join the blood, or also other hormones that are produced from the posterior pituitary that are also going to join the blood. Okay.
Doctor?
Yes.
The
Yes.
releasing and inhibiting hormones بس بيشتغلوا على anterior pituitary.
Yes.
Okay.
Organization of the pituitary blood supply. Again, the veins originating in the neurohypophyseal capillary. This is the posterior now, and this is the anterior. Okay. The veins originating in the neurohypophyseal capillary plexus give rise to the short portal veins that will also contribute to the adenohypophyseal capillary plexus. So في عندي some veins originating in the neurohypophyseal capillary plexus. They give rise also to another short هون بسميه short portal vein, in fact مش اللونج one. انتم شايفين هون في عندي اللونج one يلي هو الاساسي يلي هو عم يعمل سبلاي للانتيريور بيتويتري، يلي هو عم يعمل البورتال سيستم بين البرايمري كابيلاري بلاكسس والسكندري كابيلاري بلاكسس، وهو اللي هو حامل يعني الريليزنج اور الانهبيتوري هرمونز اللي جايين من الهايبوثالاموس. Very good. Now I do have another small portal system that is going to connect the two systems together between the anterior and the posterior pituitaries, and this is called the short portal vein. Let me see if it shows here on this figure. So the short portal vein that will also contribute to the adenohypophyseal capillary plexus, and thus effectively connect the two circulatory systems. They are going to connect the two circulatory systems. Okay, so as you can see, the hypophyseal portal veins here, and then this vein here, this is what is going to connect, or maybe this one here is going to be represented to connect the two circulatory systems together. The venous blood from both the anterior and posterior pituitary containing the anterior and posterior pituitary hormones is drained into systemic circulation. Of course, at the end, I do have the hormones that are in the blood and that are in the veins and that are going to be circulated into the systemic circulation, يعني into the peripheral blood. طيب إذا بتطلع شوي more in this figure, okay? I see here neurons. This is my hypothalamus, okay? I see here hypothalamic neurons in the paraventricular nuclei. This is my paraventricular nuclei. هيدول neurons they form a cluster اسمه PVN. Whole neurons form a cluster اسمه SON, which is the supraoptic nuclei. Very good. They have their axons that are going to be elongating into the posterior pituitary. بالterminals of their axons رح يعملوا secretion لهرمونز that are considered to be secreted يعني من posterior pituitary. So it's very easy here, okay? In particular, I have oxytocin with ADH, which are going to be produced from the posterior pituitary. Okay, so this is my hypothalamic hypophyseal tract and the storage area of hypothalamic hormones, for example. So in the vein
دكتور مين هن اللي بيعملوا ريليز لهول الهرمونز؟
هن مثل ما عم اقول these hormones الاوكسيتوسين والاي دي اتش هن الاثنين hormones that are produced from the posterior pituitary مش من الانتيريور pituitary، جايين من البوستيريور pituitary وهن جايين من البوستيريور pituitary. بس ما انا قلت البوستيريور pituitary ما فيها endocrine cells، so هي مؤلفه من terminals للاكسونز تبعوا النيوكلياي الموجودين بالبارافنتريكولار نيوكلياي وبالسوبرا اوبتيك نيوكلياي. So in fact هول الاثنين هن يلي عم يعملوا لي production للأوكسيتوسين وال ADH. يعني هول النيورونز. So الأوكسيتوسين وال ADH are going to be considered as neurohormones. لأنهم produced from neurons and they are going to join the blood. Now what about the anterior pituitary? So other clusters of neurons present in the hypothalamus, for example, this one here, neurons in the ventral hypothalamus are going to produce other type of factors that we are going to call inhibitory or releasing factors or hormones. And then these factors are going to be released here, لكن at a higher level than the others, at a higher level, يعني before the hypophysis. At the level that we call the median eminence. مشان هيك median eminence is going to be considered the last part of the hypothalamus and the first part يعني in this neuroendocrine system. And then here they are going to be released in the primary capillary plexus and then taken into the portal veins where they are going to form the secondary capillary plexus, primary capillary plexus. You can see this plexus here and this plexus here, and the portal vein in between the two. And then these hormones pass here from this secondary capillary plexus to the tissue that forms the adenohypophysis. And of course, if the cell has a receptor for this releasing hormone or inhibitory hormone, they will respond by producing other hormones or by inhibiting the release of other hormones into the systemic blood circulation, يعني into the peripheral blood. In case I do have a stimulation, the types of hormones produced here in the anterior pituitary are TSH, FSH, LH, ACTH, GH or prolactin. يعني مثل ما شايفين في عندي a wide variety of hormones that can be produced from the anterior pituitary. These hormones are not going to be produced from the same cells in the anterior pituitary, but I do have specified cells specialized in their production. If the cell is specialized, for example, in the production of the TSH, then it should have a specific receptor to a specific releasing hormone from coming from the portal system. In this case, it's going to be the TRH. Okay, تذكروا دايما لقينا ال HPA axis, hypothalamus, pituitary adrenal axis. يلي هو مثلا بيعطيني من الهايبوثالاموس TRH، بيعطيني من البيتويتري ال ACTH، وبعدين بيروح بيعطيني for example الكورتيزول بالادرينال كورتكس. Okay, so this is the HPA axis. So you can see the relationship between the hypothalamus and the two lobes of the hypophysis, which is completely different, not only at the histological level, at the tissue that is composing the anterior and posterior pituitary, but also the relationship of each of the two lobes with the hypothalamus is completely different, since one is just the terminal of the axons of these nuclei, so it's just composed of neurons, and the other one is composed of endocrine cells that are going to receive concentrated factors from the hypothalamus through the long portal system. Okay. Now, since we are talking about the hypothalamus-hypophysis axis, or HPA, hypothalamus secretes releasing or inhibiting hormones. This hypothalamus is going to secrete releasing or inhibiting hormones here. This is the primary capillary plexus, this is the portal veins, and this is the secondary capillary plexus that you can see here in purple. And then you can see different types of cells underneath in the anterior lobe of the pituitary, which are able to produce different types of hormones. There is no nerve connection to the adenohypophysis. ما في nerve connection between الhypothalamus والanterior pituitary. Releasing and inhibiting hormones sent via blood hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. So this مثل ما قلنا هالportal system يلي هو عم يجمع between الhypothalamus والanterior pituitary. What are the different types of hormones that are going to be inhibiting or releasing hormones produced from the hypothalamus? Here is a list of these hypothalamic hormones اللي نحن حندرسها. gonadotropin releasing hormone أو GnRH. This is a releasing hormone. See, thyrotropin releasing hormone, or we can call it TRH. It's also a releasing hormone. Corticotropin releasing hormone. It's also a releasing hormone, and the abbreviation here is CRH. I do also have prolactin releasing hormone. That is not very well specified, so بعد عنا doubt about it. But we do have another prolactin inhibiting hormone. Prolactin inhibiting hormone, we know it. And the growth hormone releasing hormone, which is a releasing hormone. And then somatostatin, which is also an inhibitory hormone for the growth hormone. So بس أنا أقول إنه مجموعة الهرمونز produced from the hypothalamus are releasing and inhibitory hormones. لكن as you can see, some of them يعني الستيميوليشن تبعهم هي to release production of other hormones from مثلا gonadotropin, thyrotropin, corticotropin here. But some of them also they might have a role in inhibiting the production of the hormone مثل prolactin inhibiting hormone. So the role of such a factor هو إنه يعمل inhibition للproduction of the prolactin from the anterior. Good. Now, these different hormones are going to regulate the production of other hormones from the anterior pituitary, which are FSH LH, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, under the activity of GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone يلي هي TRH, which is TSH, which is under the activity of the TRH. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, which is ACTH, واللي هي under the activity of CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone. Finally في عندي البرولاكتين والجروث هرمون يلي فيهم كتير اشياء ان كومن هول الاثنين، وحتلاقوا انه للبرولاكتين في عندي وحده ريليزنج هرمون ووحده انهبيتنج هرمون، وللجروث هرمون GH عندها وحده ريليزنج هرمون فيني سميها جروث هرمون ريليزنج هرمون، والثاني انهبيتوري هرمون للجروث هرمون فيني سميها سوماتوستاتين، او الاسم الكومن يعني متعارف عليه فيها هو السوماتوستاتين. Okay, so these are the different types of hormone that can be produced by different types of cells in the anterior pituitary. Now, for example, thyroid stimulating hormone TSH is going to be produced by thyrotrophs, من thyrotrophs. Adrenocorticotropic hormones are going to be produced from corticotrophs. Prolactin is going to be produced from lactotrophs. Growth hormone is going to be produced from somatotrophs. The follicle FSH وال LH are going to be produced from gonadotrophs. لكن مثل ما هو اسماء cells, different types of cells that are going to produce different types of hormones in the anterior pituitary gland. Okay. But since we are talking about the HPA axis, what I want you to know is that بس احكي عن الاكسس HPA منه بس الوحيد الاكسس هو الهايبوثالاميك pituitary وادرينال cortex. I do have other axes. For example اذا كانت من رح اخذ الاكزامبل تبع الثايرويد. اذا عندي من الهايبوثالاموس production لل TRH اللي هي هون, then هيدي الانتيريور pituitary will respond by producing TSH اللي هي هون, thyroid stimulating hormone. هال TSH رح تروح بالدم مثل ما قلنا الفينز رح ياخذوها بالدم and it's going to go and stimulate مين الثايرويد gland اللي هي عندنا اياها الثايرويد gland, and then they are going to stimulate the production of the thyroid hormones which are the T3 and T4. So this is another axis. بلشت فيه من TRH then the TSH until I arrive to the T3 and T4 which are the peripheral hormones that are going to act on target tissues, of course. So the endocrine hypothalamus is connected to the rest of the central nervous system by synaptic contacts from other neuronal elements. Information flow from other brain centers is relayed to the hypothalamic parvocellular neurons, which then secrete their hypophysiotropin into the pituitary portal vasculature of the median eminence. The median eminence is considered the final point of convergence of the central nervous system on the peripheral endocrine system. Okay, so the hypothalamus is connected to the rest تبع the central nervous system through synaptic contacts. من خلال السينابس والنيوروترانسميتر بيجي المسجز على الهايبوثالاموس من higher level of the central nervous system. The information will flow from other brain is related to the hypothalamic parvocellular neurons. So هودي الكلاسترز اللي حكينا عنهم مثل الاركيات نيوكلياي, في عندي different clusters يلي هن they are going هالمرة مش الكلاسترز اللي هن حيعطوني للposterior pituitary ولكن اللي بيعطوني للانتيريور pituitary. دونك اللي حيعطوني in fact النيورو هرمونز اللي هن الانهبيتوري او releasing factors, which then secrete their hypophysiotropins into the pituitary portal. يعني هالhypophysiotropins اوكي هيدول هن الهرمونز releasing or inhibitory hormones راح يكونوا secreted into the pituitary portal vasculature على البورتال blood system of the median eminence. The median eminence is considered the final point of convergence between central nervous system and the endocrine system. In this figure, I have A and B. It shows you the the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. In A, releasing or release-inhibiting hormones secreted by neurosecretory endings in the median eminence are carried via the portal vessels to the adenohypophysis, where they stimulate or inhibit secretory activity. So this is going to be my anterior pituitary. This is the portal vessel. Here is the median eminence. This is the last point of convergence between the central nervous system and the endocrine system, because these hypophysiotropins are going to be, in fact, released here at the level of the median eminence, and they are going to be taken by the portal vessels, where they are going to form the secondary capillary plexus, and then these hormones are going to stimulate the production or the inhibition of the production of other hormones from the anterior pituitary. These hormones are going to join the peripheral blood through their veins. Okay. In B, what you have in B is you have a little bit of how is this going to be regulated. So input from various neural sources. So I have different central nervous system sources that are going to put their input into the hypothalamus. So here I have a source, here I have another brain center that are going to pass a message into the hypothalamus. This message taken by the hypothalamus is going to produce, in fact, inhibitory or releasing factor into the median eminence. The median eminence take it through the portal vessel to specific cells in the adenohypophysis, and then these cells produce another hormone. This hormone goes to the peripheral target tissue, which is a peripheral gland, that will also produce other hormones. مثلا إذا كنت عم بحكي إنه الهايبوثالاموس حط هون TRH, then this adenohypophysis will produce TSH that are going to their target tissue, which is the thyroid gland, and then the thyroid gland will allow the production of T3 and T4. As you can see, I do have a circulatory feedback من ال T3 وال T4 على ال pituitary وعلى الhypothalamus, or even in some cases at a higher level of centers in the brain. So ليعملوا feedback usually in order to attenuate this axis. يعني يرجعوا يمنعوا production، يمنعوا further production مثلا of TRH or of TSH here. Okay, so this is the regulation. Okay. The hypothalamus hypophysis axis. The hypothalamus contains neurosecretory neurons which synthesize hormones. هلا حنبلش نركز أكثر على الhypothalamus. So I already gave, in fact, what I gave till now is what is the hypothalamus and what is present. What is the hypophysis and what is it composed of. Okay. هلا بدنا نبلش نفوت بالهرمونز that are produced in the hypothalamus. And then later on in the chapter, we see the hormones that are produced from the hypophysis. So the hypothalamus contains neurosecretory neurons, which synthesize hormones that are of peptidic nature, يعني the chemical structure تبعهم are peptides, and they can also be catecholamines. Hypothalamic hormones are peptide except dopamine, which is a catecholamine. لكن كل الهرمونز that are produced من الhypothalamus are of peptidic nature ما عدا الدوبامين, which is going to be considered one of the catecholamines that are produced usually in the brain, but also are going to be produced from the adrenal medulla. Later on, we see this in the last chapter. Some hypothalamic hormones are either released into the systemic circulation to target distant tissues or released into portal circulation for delivery to the anterior pituitary, where they stimulate or inhibit the release of the anterior pituitary hormones. If I want to give examples of hypothalamic hormones, such as they are releasing hormones, RH, such as GnRH for gonadotropin releasing hormones. They can also be inhibitory hormones, such as somatostatin. Somatostatin is one of the famous inhibitory hormones known from the hypothalamus, and it's also can be called growth hormone release inhibiting hormone. So شو الرول تبعها رح يكون للسوماتوستاتين is to inhibit the release of the growth hormone from the anterior pituitary. Good. And then I also should, of course, have pituitary receptors طبعا على specific cells of hypothalamic releasing hormone, and then these receptors usually that are present in these cells are they belong to the family of GPCR or G protein coupled receptors. Okay, so like hypothalamic hormones can be releasing hormones or can be inhibitory hormones. The receptors that are for these hormones are usually they belong to the G protein coupled receptors. Hypothalamic hormones. The hypothalamic hormones are mainly of polypeptidic nature. ما عدا الدوبامين مثل ما قلنا. Many contain very few amino acids and we can distinguish GHRH for growth hormone releasing hormone, SRIF for somatostatin releasing inhibiting factor or you can call it somatostatin. هلا بعض الأحيان هن بيكونوا محطوطين مش بأوردر معين. أنا بصراحة I prefer to put them in a certain order which is the order that you already saw here. I will show it to you one more time here. هيدا الأوردر المحطوطين فيه الهايبوثالاميك هرمونز is very convenient. ليش؟ لأنه عندي الجونادوتروفين releasing hormone GnRH with TRH وال CRH مع بعضهم and then I have 2 للبرولاكتين و 2 للجروث هرمون which shows you very easily إنه بس عندي وحدة releasing hormone للجونادوتروفين وحدة releasing للثايروتروفين وحدة releasing للكورتيكوتروفين and you will see why later on while إنه للبرولاكتين ولا الجروث هرمون ما بكتفي بس بالريليزنج هرمون I do have also an inhibitory hormone for each of them. Okay, so this order is kind of nice for you to be able to identify them. So here I come back مثل ما قلنا كل هيدول neurohormones produced from the hypothalamus are going to be composed of amino acids because they are of proteinic nature ما عدا الدوبامين يلي هو is considered under the structure of catecholamines. We can distinguish GHRH, which is the growth hormone releasing hormone. So this would release the GH. Or العكسة هي somatostatin, which is an inhibitory factor للgrowth hormone. You have also gonadotrophin releasing hormone, corticotrophin releasing hormone, what TRH for thyrotrophin releasing hormone. And finally, you have the prolactin inhibitory factors and prolactin releasing factors that are not very well characterized. The somatostatin, also known as growth hormone inhibiting hormone or SRIF for somatotropin release inhibitory factor or somatotropin release inhibiting hormone. يعني بس تكونوا تعودتوا على الأسماء إنه growth hormone inhibitory hormone أو أحسن شيء تحفظوا أنا بالنسبة إلي somatostatin which is the common name of this hormone and you keep in mind إنه it is an inhibitory hormone for the growth hormone لأن البقية معناهم موجود بالاسم. يعني أنا إذا بجي بقول لكم prolactin inhibitory factor أو إذا بقول growth hormone release hormone مثلا هذه ما عندها اسم ثاني خلص growth hormone releasing hormone. This is a hormone that will allow the release of the growth hormone from the adenohypophysis, right? So somatostatin هي is the one that will inhibit the production of the growth hormone. I will stop here. I will next time talk about briefly about each one of these hormones. They can be composed of 3 amino acids up to 44 amino acids. So their lengths of their peptides are different. But for these factors, we do not have to have a lot of information about their production. Just a brief of each of them. المهم إنه أعرف the role of each of them. Okay. So next time I go a little bit briefly through them and then I start the adenohypophysis or لا neurohypophysis hormones يعني الأكسيتوسين وال ADH.
دكتور
يعطيك العافية دكتورة.
الله يعافيك.
دكتور
Yes, one moment بس.